Hello and welcome to the second online session for Work-Based Supervisors, and this session will focus on direct observation. My name is Jenny Simpson. This presentation is only relevant to Work-Based Supervisors who have agreed with the long-arm practice educator or the practice educator in their organisation to actually undertake an observation as part of 3 observations that are required to be carried out for students studying with Nottingham Trent University. So what will be covered in today's session? Well, first of all, what we're going to do is we're going to begin with a brief introduction to direct observations. We're then going to look at direct observation as a form of assessment. And then we're going to look at, in particular at a model called Negotiated Collaborative Model of Direct Observation with its 4 separate stages. And then finally, we'll finish off with sharing results of the direct observation with the practice educator. So let's jump straight in to look at a brief introduction to direct observations. Direct observation of practice is a requirement for learners on the qualifying social work courses, whether that be BA or MA. Observations of practice provide rich opportunities for learning. So in terms of the student placement, the objective of a direct observation is to provide evidence of the student's ability to meet some elements of the PCF. It's noted that discussing the direct observation in supervision beforehand supports the student's learning and also highlights to the student future learning needs in terms of their practice. The direct observation and your feedback constitutes written evidence which should be applied as part of the overall practice educator report that's completed by the practice educator. So in other words, you as the work-based supervisor are supporting that function and contributing to the final report. Simply put, a direct observation involves watching a task being undertaken, evaluating performance, and providing feedback. You might be of the view that a direct observation is an accurate assessment tool because you can actually see what the student is doing. However, it's important to bear in mind that observations can only ever provide a snapshot of practice at that time and in that moment. And without the fuller understanding of the context and background, it might be very difficult to be thoroughly accurate and evaluate what is being seen. Even if you are the work-based supervisor who have been and where you've been working with that student on a regular basis, there are still elements in terms of that direct observation that you will not be aware of. So therefore, in many ways, it is only a snapshot of practice. Where direct observations as a concept have been the focus of research, it's been found that there have been concerns raised about its reliability and accuracy of method. And the skills of the observer are hugely important. Furthermore, there's a need for standardization of methods, assessment objectives and criteria. And what these things do is they increase the reliability of the judgments made by the observer. Additionally, research undertaken by Research in Practice identified that direct observations were most beneficial when they were experienced as a developmental process that students could learn from rather than an assessment process. And that's a really important point. Direct observations can also be seen as a reality check for the student. In other words, what the student can do is it helps the student understand the perception that is held either by the practice educator or by yourself as the work-based supervisor, and what perception is held by the student, and that is then open to discussion. So it's a wonderful discussion tool to enable the student to understand the extent to which they are meeting the requirements of the PCF. There are a number of things that make direct observations a good method for evaluating where the student is at. And one of them is that it provides a way of evaluating the skills and behaviours of the student whilst in placement. But there are a number of disadvantages as far as direct observations are concerned, and this includes it actually requires a lot of time to prepare. The presence of the observer can actually change not only the student's performance and can prove to be intimidating, but it can also in many ways change the interaction of everyone who is being observed. And so this is something that really does need to be taken into account and also remembered as part of preparing for a direct observation. So where does the direct observation sit as a form of assessment within the placement? What you can see in front of you is a picture that sets out the various types of evidence that is often generated during a student placement. And you can see that a direct observation can be either formal or informal. As a work-based supervisor, you are working alongside the student, and therefore you'll have many opportunities for both informal and formal observation of the student's practice. However, as part of ensuring clarity, there's a need to enable the student to understand that the observation being undertaken will be formal. And it's important to remember that the direct observation informs the assessment of the student overall in terms of the practice placement, and it's not simply a benchmark of pass or fail. And it's important that that is understood by the student and part of the discussion that you would have with the practice educator as you are preparing for the direct observation. For NTU students, there are 3 mandatory direct observations that need to be completed as part of the placement. 2 of them are completed by the practice educator. The preference for direct observation is 1 observation at the beginning of the placement, 1 observation just before or just after the midpoint review, and 1 observation towards the end of the placement. 1 direct observation should take place, as said, before the midpoint review. And again, that's in part of informing the assessment of the student in terms of their progress overall. Now, as said before, there's 1 observation that can be delegated by the practice educator to another person, and that might be you as a work-based supervisor. And with that in mind, one of the things that you'll have to do is negotiate with the practice educator as to when you will carry out your direct observation, and in particular, what PCF domains that observation might pertain to, again, as part of gathering that entire evidence. It's also important that you're aware that in terms of after the observation has been undertaken and the observation report written up, it needs to be returned to the student within a period of 2 weeks of completing the observation. So let's turn our attention to Davies and Beddoes' negotiated collaborative model. And it's a 4-step process of live observation that can help to reduce the student's anxiety by inviting the student to join with yourself as the work-based supervisor to identify the parameters of the observation, that is the purpose, the roles and the process, and also to participate in the evaluation and feedback and to commit to future action. So what are the 4 parts of this model? So the first part is preparation, the second part is observation, the third part is debriefing and feedback, and the 4th is next steps, where we're looking at practice development. The model itself is based on 4 underlying principles. The first being that feedback criteria must be overt and negotiated between yourself and the student. That specific, appreciative and strengths-based feedback is heard from both the student and also the observer. In this case, it would be you. That the discussion and reflections between the student, Work-based supervisor, following the feedback, creates an opportunity for professional conversations and practice development for both parties. In other words, meaning that you as the work-based supervisor can use the observation as a way of reflecting on your own practice in terms of social work education. And that the learning identified, the fourth principle being that the learning identified by all participants will be followed with a commitment to introduce into the future new practice. The model began with the early work of Jane Maidment, and then it was further developed by Liz Beddoe and her colleagues Ackroyd, Chinnery and Appleton, and then it finally evolved into this four-step negotiated collaborative model. But before undertaking the observation, it's important that you as the work-based supervisor discuss with the practice educator exactly what would constitute an observation. So what do I mean by this? Well, for example, it could be that the student has been observed twice working with service users, and therefore the practice educator would like you to concentrate on domain 9, which is professional leadership. And what this requires is that the student is observed contributing maybe to or leading a multi-agency meeting, or they may be observed presenting an area of knowledge at a team meeting. So let's begin with the first step, which is preparation. We need to remember that for students, a direct observation can be a time of great anxiety, not only for them, but actually for the person observing the student, i.e. yourself. So it's important to ensure that the purpose of the direct observation is clear and that you have agreed that with the student. The purpose of the direct observation should have been the source of discussion between yourself and the practice educator beforehand, and also between the student and the practice educator, as part of ensuring that everyone understands what will be taking place and appreciates how this evidence complements the existing evidence that's been collated to this point. So nothing should come as a surprise. A way that ensures that everyone has a clear understanding of what the purpose and the parameters of the direct observation is and how it will be evaluated is in actual fact to put it in writing to the student and then copying in the practice educator. Alternatively, you could have a three-way supervision, a face-to-face or Microsoft Teams verbal supervision where all of this is agreed, and what that will do is very much it will save time and everyone will have a very clear understanding of what is required. But I would still suggest that this is followed up in writing and shared with the student, and details such as how, where and when the direct observation will take place, and also the expected duration of the direct observation, including any pre-meeting or feedback time, and what you will be observing and what evidence is required to demonstrate or satisfy the PCF domains that have been identified as needing evidence. Other aspects that need to be covered by the email and taken into account is how feedback will be collected from service users, colleagues or other professionals, depending on the context, and how it will be used. And again, all by sharing such information, you can reduce the anxiety of the student. You need to also think about how you will record the details of the direct observation and use this both for feedback and for the purposes of the practice educator report. And again, this is something that I would suggest that you would need to discuss with the practice educator beforehand, and then having agreed what the approach is, then go on to inform the student. The other thing you need to think about is how issues concerning conduct, performance are to be addressed as part of the feedback. So in other words, if it is found that the student's performance was very poor, how is that going to be addressed in terms of the feedback? Again, this is something that you would need to discuss with the practice educator, because obviously it's something that the practice educator would want to discuss as part of the student's supervision. And also, what needs to happen is you need to very clearly state when the feedback report will be expected. And as said previously, it's got to be within 2 weeks of the observation. Having decided upon and made clear the objectives and the evaluation criteria will enable you as the work-based supervisors to focus on specific areas of practice and also write detailed notes on these areas during the observation itself. And obviously what this will do is it will enable you to provide good quality feedback and increase the accuracy and fairness of the feedback that is given. It will also ensure that the student has a clear focus for their self-evaluation and is able to retain some control over their learning and assessment. So let's just take a moment to think about supporting the student to prepare for a direct observation and team members or other professionals. And as you can see, there are a whole series of people involved. And so it's important as part of the direct observation to take time to think about who the audience will be, who's involved in this direct observation. You will need to help the student to think carefully about the direct observation, regardless of who that audience is, whether it be service users, team members, or other professionals. And certainly what you will need to do is just to think about, in terms of a service user, is it reasonable for that service user to be involved given their circumstances? It's important that service users do not feel obligated to become involved because they are actually receiving services from the student. Service users need to be given choices, and those choices also include the option not to be involved at all. This is a key part of the process. You and the student will need to plan how this is managed using your knowledge of and relationship with the service user to ensure that the service user is actually comfortable to go ahead with the direct observation. The same is true for either team members or other professionals. So again, it's something permission has always got to be sought. Careful thought also will need to be given where a service user has a seen or unseen disability. Again, there's a need to avoid any hint of obligation. If the observation involves other team members, there's a need for you as a work-based supervisor to set the tone of the direct observation. Where the direct observation involves other professionals, you may need to support the student to arrange the direct observation, confirming with practitioners that confidentiality will be taken seriously and GDPR will be adhered to. There will also be the need to ensure that permission has been sought beforehand for the direct observation. You'll also need to give thought as the work-based supervisor and also the student about the seating arrangements. As a work-based supervisor, you need to make sure that you can see the student, but that you're not directly in the line of sight of the student in order to reduce any sense of anxiety that the student might have. You'll also need to give thought to verbal feedback in terms of how and when to collect that feedback from those involved in the observation and also the student. In terms of the student, you may want to give initial feedback after the observation to allay any concerns or anxiousness that the student has, and then arrange a meeting to provide the feedback in full. This means this requires careful planning to ensure that you're fair in your dealings with the student. You'll also need to give consideration beforehand regarding what you will do if you need to participate. And in what circumstances. So an example of that would be if the direct observation goes terribly wrong, and that, say, it involved a service user. The service user became very upset and started shouting. on that basis, would you just leave the student to work their way through that, or have you made the decision beforehand and also communicated it to the student when and under what circumstances you would, in actual fact, participate in the direct observation? Again, this all has to be made clear. And if you're not quite clear what that should look like, again, you are advised to have a discussion with the practice educator. It's important that you remember that if you do end up participating in the direct observation, you're more likely to disrupt the observation, and also the student is likely to lose confidence. So it's important to remember that you bear in mind that you are observing the student's practice according to the PCF and not how you would carry out the activity if you were given the opportunity to do so. So let's take a few more moments to think about this notion of intervening into a direct observation. As you can see from Humphrey, it's actually not helpful. And if you do so, you can see that you are likely to impact quite adversely what happens. And as you can see again from Humphrey, he talks about that any intervention must be strictly rationed. So it's not something that you should be automatically seeking to do unless you think that the student is having difficulty, or that the behaviours of the service user are hugely challenging. So let's move to the next step, and that's the observation itself. So one of the things that you can do in terms of supporting the student and supporting those who are being observed is that you reassure everyone, and that you help them to recognize that the interaction that takes place as part of the observation needs to be as natural as possible. So once the observation has started, it's important that you take notes. And in terms of the notes you take, again, you need to be quite mindful, because you need to be looking at what the student is doing and not got your head down simply writing lots of notes. But in terms of the notes themselves, it's advisable that after the observation you book in time, if you can, to write up your notes for your own purposes and as part of preparing for feedback to the student. Doing this promptly means it can be a quick job rather than trying to remember all the details later, which is much harder and actually takes much longer to do. Quickly giving feedback also makes the observation far more meaningful to the student and more meaningful to you. So what you can do is, after the observation has taken place, you can then go back to the student and give a brief overview of what you've seen and state that you're planning to discuss this in further detail. The other thing that you need to also remember is that throughout the observation, you need to ensure that you stick to the objectives that have been agreed with the student. And also, you've got to remember to ensure that feedback is taken from either service users or colleagues or other professionals, and what that will look like. So you should have gotten in touch with them beforehand as part of preparing for the direct observation to say that you will be taking feedback. So let's move to the third part of the model. And this is around debriefing and feedback. And it's important to remember that debriefing and feedback are not the same thing and may occur together or in actual fact separately. And it's important to remember that to debrief the student immediately after the session, but also to have the feedback as close to the session as possible. It's important to provide an opportunity for the debrief of the student so that they can talk about how they felt and their immediate reactions with regards to what happened during the course of the observation. And they have an opportunity to think quite immediately about how their practice could be improved. It's also essential that they have the opportunity for some immediate feedback from you as well, the work-based supervisor. Now, if the direct observation goes badly, that doesn't mean that the learning has gone wrong. Rather, what it means is that there may be the need for deeper reflection on the part of the student. And in such circumstances, it would be sensible to call and make contact with the practice educator to talk through how best to frame the feedback and also how best to respond to the student. We've already identified that debriefing and feedback are two very separate things. They can happen one after the other, or they can happen quite separately. But focusing on the feedback, it should be undertaken as part of a two-way conversation. So, as you can see there are some bullet points whereby the student and then you as the work-based supervisor have a series of questions that you need to answer. And at the point of the formal feedback meeting, it may be useful to begin by reminding the student of the objectives of the direct observation and what the student wanted to achieve. You might then go on to ask the student to begin with their observations about their practice, and then you follow on with your comments in a similar vein. It's also going to be important for you to give consideration as to how you will give critical feedback. So think about the messages you want to leave the student with, bearing in mind that the direct observation is a developmental process. Above all, what you should be engaging in is a discussion with the student that is mutually respectful and which opens up possibilities for changes in practice, not just the students, but also your own. Don't underestimate the time that it will take you to verbally feed back to the student. So do ensure that you book out sufficient time. And again, what you can do is you can speak to the practice educator and talk to them about their experiences. So as part of the direct observation, one of the things that you need to be aware of is that there is a direct observation form which forms part of the student portfolio. And there are a number of parts to it. So in part one, it's about really going over many of the things that I've mentioned before about ensuring that the student provides you with direct observation before the planning of it. You need to remember that actually it's a summary of the student's capabilities as demonstrated in the direct observation as part of their practice. You'll also, as we've already mentioned before, need to ensure that you've got specific examples that evidence the domains that have been met, and also the knowledge and skills statement. And that's why it's really important to talk about these things beforehand. And you will need to identify areas of strength and development. So moving on to part two. So that's where you are putting in details of the feedback that you either receive from a service user, a colleague, or professionals. And again, you will need to be adept in terms of your planning in order for you to speak and obtain feedback, but then take all of that to feed back to the students. So you might want to do the observation in the morning and then come back to the student around lunchtime. Who knows? It depends on your diary, but it's just thinking about the implications of that. The next section is part 3, and this is where the student needs to complete the section of the form where they are asked to reflect upon the feedback given by you and also by others. And that has to be filled in. That's a very necessary part of the process. So here we have the final section of the direct observation form, which is concerned with negotiating the specific areas of development and learning and what actions need to be taken. As you've already developed and should have developed a collaborative approach with the student, this aspect of the form should not come as a surprise to either you or the student, and you should be able to identify specific areas of development based on the objectives of the direct observation. Once you've completed the final section of the form, both you and the student will need to sign it, and a copy of the form should also be made available to the practice educator. It's really important as part of the entire process that you share the results of the direct observation with the practice educator. And again, this allows the practice educator to reflect upon the student's entire performance across the entirety of the placement. And in many ways, as we've seen with part 4 of the direct observation form, this is almost like the 4th step of the process in terms of the model that we've been looking at, in that it allows the student to reflect upon what they've been doing and allow further discussion in terms of their overall learning and development. It's important that when the final direct observation report is written, that you provide a copy to the practice educator and the student within the specified timescales. So let's take a moment to remember what a good direct observation is based upon. So it's based upon negotiating with the student the objectives of the direct observation and also the outcomes that the student wants to achieve. And this is going to be based on previous conversations both the student and you have had with the practice educator. You've also got to ensure that all the practicalities of the direct observation are given attention. That's consent, information shared, rooms where the direct observation is taking place, the collating of feedback from others, and the provision of feedback by you. You need to understand the difference between debriefing and formally feeding back to the student and the type of conversation that's involved. And finally, you need to discuss and then share the details of the completed direct observation with the practice educator. Thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation on direct observations. I hope that you found it helpful and useful. If there's any aspect that is unclear, please contact your practice educator or alternatively get in touch with the university. Thank you very much.